Welcome to The Floor, the new show I'm trying out in which we invoke discussion around a particular topic. I platform the interesting stuff you guys have had to say. We bounce back and forth. Today we'll be looking at the Sunqua Peak, the newest fractal. Can you believe? Came out 3 weeks ago now already. And it's funny, for all the discussion and videos and stuff we did as it released, I've really not thought about the subject material much lately. So it's kind of nice to get back into it. I've got a selection of comments from you guys that I honestly find really profound in some ways. Also, just as a little note, I guess that time of year has come again for me where I start messing with my microphone and believe that it's not good enough and I can set things up better. So if you've got any thoughts about that, and I don't want to prompt you into saying one thing or another, just let me know down below. So let's get stuck in. The Sunqua Peak, I think you can just enjoy on a very immediate level. You don't really have to talk too much more about it, especially if you're into the emotion of the piece and the poetry we got there. But there are definitely some mysteries and some weird elements that it seems, as clueless as I was about them when I produced my first video, everyone else is also quite clueless about. I'm looking forward to platforming some of your response on them. Hewer opens with this message, which I'm not going to read in full. You guys can pause if you like, but it is pretty interesting because they were able to translate these names. Specifically here, you'll see they open by saying I, generally as a common Chinese name, loosely means love. And you can kind of see how these things fit together in the story. Lan means orchid, which I think Hewer quite rightly notices fits very comfortably into this idea of the seasons and the year and how we transform as time moves forwards. They round out by saying, I personally am very excited to see more ties with Asian culture coming into the new expansion, as I'm fascinated by the language and the ways the language can be used in different manner from Western ones. Seeing this fractal makes me really excited to see End of Dragons. I can't wait to see more. This is a whole side of the X-Pack that I myself am largely ignorant on, and particularly I remember the devs did a good job with Guild Wars 1 and factions when we first got to go to Cantha. So many of the place names and character names were just indecipherable to me almost. Hell, most of them I still don't know how to pronounce. I've always been kind of okay in that ignorance, but now, especially with the release of this fractal, I'm kind of wondering about that. Like, I didn't know the whole surname, first name swap thing until this fractal came out and people started to discuss it, and then I realized that in Guild Wars 1 they had it one way, and now in Guild Wars 2 they've got it the other. I think that ArenaNet will do justice to this area of the world. There is that whole story about NCSoft holding off with the Cantha release because of, you know, this whole Pan-Asian aesthetic that encompasses too many different societies. But really, I think a lot of what was actually happening, and I mentioned this in a recent video, is I think it just had to do with their plans to launch this MMO out in the East, and they didn't want to tamper with that in any major way back in the early days. And now we've obviously seen their release in China, we've seen the success it's gonna get, and now they're a bit more blasé about it. So ArenaNet can dive into this stuff, and they really can look at the real world, and they can draw from it in exciting and compelling ways for those of us who are not in a position of ignorance. It's been kind of fun, really. Usually I have a pretty complete picture of what's going on, and I present it to you guys in the community. You say, oh, I didn't realize this was connected to X, Y, and Z. I get more value out of the game now. And for this fractal, and I think it's probably likely a lot as we go through Cantha, it's going to be the other way around. It's going to be me seeing the community mentions all this stuff that I just have no idea about, that now really helps to complete my experience. So, looking forward to that. Next we have Molish, who said, not sure if this relates, but in the letters, Beau said that he was the master of the stave, and the Ascendant Daredevil staff is also named Beau. Was Beau the first Daredevil? I know that Beau is also just the name for a traditional staff, but I think it's interesting that Beau in the letters specifically mentioned his prowess with staves. So, I also want to draw your attention to this response from Daniel lower down. It's an interesting idea, but I think the name Beau, with regard to the Daredevil staff, is simply related to the real-life wooden ones. And then he goes on to quote Wikipedia for a moment. So, I did want to show this because a lot of people wanted to talk about the Beau staff thing. When I first played the Fractal, and looking back now, I have to be honest, I don't really think ArenaNet is hinting too closely here. I mean, yes, he does specifically mention he has prowess with staves, and there is space in lore for them to talk about the first people to use this weapon and how they utilized it. There's actually some fun other stuff I'd like to see in Cantha along these lines, like the chakrams and stuff. But I don't really know if details like that are super necessary, or even that fascinating should they come out. But sure, I'd accept it. A little bit more detail about the elite specs is always good. It's one of the things I massively applauded Path of Fire for doing, actually having in-game representatives that utilize the new elite specializations, as opposed to Heart of Thorns that really just dumped them in. And so taking this opportunity to look back at one of those HOT ones that's kind of a little bit deficient is pretty smart to me. Again, I don't have too much to say on this topic, but it does seem unfair that I wouldn't mention this bow thing, but I would focus on the whole spear thing and the 7 spears of Cantha. It was 7 spears, wasn't it? Which again felt very direct, and this is about as direct as that was, so it's worth noting. I think I read on the forum several months ago now, I'm unfortunately not going to be able to find this post, but someone made a pretty compelling case for the splitting of many of the Guild Wars 2 in-game skins for staves, because there's kind of a weird thing happening ever since the Daredevil came out, and of course the Revenant as well, which is that you've got the traditional Guild Wars staff, which is for spell casting, and the communal with magic and the conjuring of things. And then you kind of have a whole other weapon that's just dumped in the same category, and that's a battle staff, something that you're actually hitting people with. And some skins are very clearly in the battle staff category rather than the others, and then we even have the idea of scythes basically being mixed in there too. Scythes which look increasingly short-sighted as a skin type as we go on, and I want more and more to have real scythes. But it's weird because there are a billion staff skins. You kind of could split them down the middle and say, no, this is a full new weapon category now. But all of this obviously falls under radical revamps for existing systems that I think the studio is leery about touching. Would they go for that though? All of a sudden a little tidbit about the first people to use battle staves makes a lot of sense. Next, we have a message from Affy, who says, I find the background of the Norn to be super interesting. Sorry if you mentioned this in the video, but for some speculation, Beau says her name is Hayo-son. This sounds like maybe a Canthan translation or reinterpretation of a Norn name. Think back to the Norn naming conventions. This maybe indicates they're the son of Hayo, perhaps derived from Hjor or something more Nordic. For example, Airson could be heir, son, in Canthan. As you mentioned, Canthans traditionally swap the order of surnames. So, in the story, the daughter's name is Lan, but her full name is Lilan. So, when the dad talks about Hayo-son, the Norn maybe introduced herself as XXX Hayo-son, the Western Norn introduction, but Beau interprets it in his local way, which indicates that Hayo-son is the first name. One thing that this doesn't account for is that Hayo-son is a woman and would traditionally be Hayo-daughter, or something like that. Maybe that convention was lost after some time in Cantha. So people, I'm actually a little bit worried about this. People really took to the Norn idea. And if I'm reading my own comments, I'm seeing people talking in a very concrete way as no, there was a Norn in this fractal. Let's just be clear. It is just a theory that it's a Norn, and I'm not necessarily accusing Affy of making this mistake here. But I think a lot of us are very convinced by the Norn proposition. Let's just remember it may not be true whatsoever. I think it's perfect for so many reasons, particularly how closely Norn culture and societal customs mirror that of what was going on down in Cantha, particularly with ancestor worship. But yeah, this was a beautiful detail that I didn't think of. Of course, it does sound a lot like you said, I am Bram Airson, and so now here this Canthan interprets it in the local way and thinks that's the first name instead. And there you have it. It works so well, except the whole gender issue. Because, yeah, she's a woman. It would have been Hayo-daughter. And I don't know, we're right on the precipice here. I'm wondering if ArenaNet thought that deeply about this. Maybe they did, but you have to remember, when they're going for some really complicated idea like this, if it is indeed deliberate, they have to have a lot of trust that the community will also have a like mind, and we're kind of deep into the specifics of how the first name and second name swaps now, but it's really cool. In fact, I've got a lot of great messages about the Norn stuff as we go through here today. Moving over to one of the other mysteries, we have the graves. Now remember, the graves looked like they had a typo, because they are actually 1,000 years earlier than all the other dates we have. And I said, wow, this kind of looks like it might be a mistake. It might also just be because it's the fractals and they're trying to tell this story about, you know, people living on loops. There's people go through these experiences cyclically, just as the years are on a cycle, or something like that. Maybe it was something metaphorical. Maybe it was the poetry of the thing. And we don't really have to think about how all of it actually logically connects. But it is this weird incongruence that these graves are 1,000 years old. And through that whole discussion, you know, what's just constantly beating in my ear is, it's a typo, it's a typo, it's a typo. And we've been left to wonder about that. There was a stream after my coverage of the fractal in which the devs were asked about this, and they basically hand-wave it in all the same ways that they hand-waved the idea of Demos being a real demon or not. Like, it's up to you to believe one thing or the other. Look, I will accept that as an answer from the studio on very rare occasions. I hope they don't make a habit of it, though. I want something concrete on this. So, we still don't really know. What we do know is that they never patched it later, so it is what it is. Maybe they're happy for it to just be this bizarre date. But that leads me now to this message from Kabansky, who says the dates are actually a bit over 1,000 years off. So it's definitely not just some random typo. Well, that does make it seem more convincing and deliberate, doesn't it? Unless the idea is that they had a kind of work in progress idea for the date, it appeared onto the graves, and then later on, they made separate decisions to have it 1,000 years forwards, and then they tweaked it a little bit further, but they just never went back to the graves. So I still can see it being a mistake. I wouldn't use the word definitely, but yeah, the fact that it's not just this clean extra 1,000, but it's 1,000 and a bit makes it look more deliberate for sure. Another comment, the picture Dessa mentions might refer to the locket you get with the auto-consume item rewarded for the letter achievement. Somehow this should be important according to the devs, though if Dessa is even supposed to know of it is anyone's guess. So this is one of the subjects that I didn't really get into much on the video because it's kind of a weird under the hood thing. What I think's happened with this fractal is this. They split off a good chunk of the story in the dialogue to only be after the achievements. The achievements are meant to get you invested in the story so that the player that's done that now is happy to watch the cutscene. And this is kind of a smart way of making it so that the people who are just there for their daily fractal or just there for the fractal specific rewards, they don't have to sit through unnecessarily long cutscenes. Unfortunately, the fractal suffers from those problems anyway because of this weird start-stop section in the center near the graveyard, which is a bit of a shame. But that final cutscene is kind of completely separated. I don't know how necessary this was for ArenaNet to do. If you look back at the Arc trilogy, you'll know that if you just stand around, say at the end of the Shattered Observatory, eventually a lot of dialogue and cutscene stuff will play, but most people miss it because there's the ready up thing on the screen anyway. So I don't know why they didn't just redo that, but they've got this concept in here that beating the achievement meta gives you an item that doesn't really appear in your inventory anywhere. The only way you can find the item is by mousing over it in the reward box for the achievement user interface. And when you mouse over it, it's a letter of some sort. And it says it's something like an account service. So for a lot of us on our first run through, we were mousing over this thinking, what the hell is this service that we might get? I don't know, and we were all getting really excited. I don't know whether it was anything to really look that deeply into. I think that's just their way of expressing, hey, this will now cause a cutscene to trigger for you. This will now give you the final bit of the story and obviously unlock CM for you. And so then we get to Dessa's dialogue about a letter. Well, it stands to reason it could be this thing from the achievement UI, but then the problem there is that Dessa will refer to that even long before you've unlocked it. You know, like on my first run, I took 5 players in there, none of us had any achievements. We got to the final boss, we didn't have the meta done yet. There's a bunch of stuff you could only get the meta if you repeated the fractal. So, but there on that very first time, Dessa's already talking about a letter as though we've already picked it up. And so it's a bit confusing. It was extra confusing even further still because for most of us on our first run through, we probably didn't find all the extra little environment objects around. But that's my guess. That's what I think they're talking about with Dessa there. And it just comes across a bit strange. Another thing I find myself going in circles over is, remember, this fractal was like originally gonna be a part of Dessa's trilogy story. And we know that it's not that anymore, but I keep thinking, oh, what details made it through? And especially, you know, Dessa kind of is in the same situation as some of these characters, so it feels somehow relevant to her. I wonder if that was always going on, but we know that they only repurposed it to be a factions and Canthan themed fractal kind of late in the day. I think the main thing they took right was the gameplay and the layout and the idea of climbing a mountain. So then I kind of have to stop myself. But it is a weird one, that dialogue about a letter that most people are just going to think, what? A quick little comment on a quick little comment here. Other than Dave said, didn't Balthazar also say something about dimming one's light? So this to me is an interesting observation. I didn't think of that line and that quote from Balthazar at all. I knew that when I played this new Fractal, that statement, that sentiment really stirred something in me. So if you go back on my channel and you look at the videos I did on Sunqua, I actually put that on the thumbnail because I thought that this idea of light versus darkness in some very real ways is the main story here, and the connections to Deepstone and the shadows there and so on, and the light of Deljamor. So I kind of added that, not because I think that ArenaNet put much emphasis on it, but that's something that captured me about this Fractal. Only for this comment to come in and remind me, oh yeah, we kind of had that with the gods too. And yes, maybe you can read into that. That is a part of the whole mystery of what really happened between the gods and where Lissa sits with all of this. But I don't think that they're necessarily connected. What I do want to point out down here is Shroom1up, who says, not connected, Fractal Stories are standalone, all in caps. So let's talk about this just a little bit. He's right that Fractal Stories are, generally speaking, standalone. Not all of them. Some of them do segue into each other, as we've seen. But yeah, they're kind of their own little experiences. When you look at the Fractal that came with Daybreak, you know, that's really just dealing with the story of Palawa and the Awakened in that place at that time. You don't have to look much further. And in general, I think that each Fractal Island is meant to be enjoyed as its own separate little experience. Don't read too deeply into it. All of that, and the devs have pretty much come out and said as much. All of that said, that doesn't prohibit the studio from laying the groundwork or little hints and tiny threads that do end up becoming meaningful elsewhere in the game. You can have your cake and eat it too here. You can have something that is generally designed to be consumed as a standalone experience, but that lays a little bit of paving for something you're going to walk a lot of stuff on later. And that's exactly what I think Sunqua Peak is doing in a great many places. Yeah, this Balthazar one is probably a bit of a stretch. That line is probably just fitting for how Balthazar spoke because of the brightness of the gods and so on. But I don't think it's right to shout someone down with the all caps. They're not connected, they're standalone. They can be both. It can be standalone and hint at other stuff. And where more appropriate than in a Fractal based in a location we're going to get a full expansion on later. Barandu has a message that I never got out in my video at all. It seems so obvious to me. A long shot, but what if the laser element is some kind of teaser for the new Elementalist Elite spec? Maybe a whole new element as a specialization. To which Mush says a fifth Aether-like element for Ellie would line up with Japanese conception of the 5 elements, and there's nowhere else to go with Ellie Elites anyway. And Ray says it looks to be just arcane energy. Well, I think all three of you, maybe, have got something here. First of all, I was not familiar, again here, with a Japanese conception of there being 5 elements. But just arcane energy, I mean, you guys have probably seen the Elite speculation that I did with Boots recently on the Ellie. I've a long time been a fan of them doing some kind of Arcanist with the arcane element spec. This could be the opportunity for it. Look at your utility skills as an Ellie. You have a fire signet, a fire shout, a fire conjure, and so on. You've got an earth one, a water one. And then finally also there's arcane, just this extra thing. Even rebound, the extra skill on the Tempest, if you look at that, the actual tooltip text, they talk about arcane. So yeah, having a full element for arcane works, and maybe that's what we see that this final boss, particularly in the second phase of CM, is doing. I spent a long time in that fight, and I never thought that maybe this visual is what they would assign to some kind of actual arcane element one day. Imagine if they had renamed the Sorrowful Spellcaster to Arcanist or something, then it probably would have tipped their hand a little bit too much. We'll see when they reveal it, and hey, they've announced this expansion early, like with Heart of Thorns, so they could do some really good stuff where they steadily give us the elite specs again. That'd be amazing. It might be sooner than we think. Alright, I'm overhyping myself. Some quick video feedback from Rasmus, who left a comment. I was scared there were going to be loads of these comments. This is the only one I could find. It has 3 thumbs, but I do want to talk about it. Kind of disappointed that you didn't include any of the voiceover dialogue in a lore video. That has to be as important as the letters. So yes, I made the very conscious decision with this to not include and splice in all the little bits of dialogue. I got into a place where I was doing that with a lot of the new releases, like over Season 3, and I really got burned out by it, guys. I don't like simply regurgitating what is in-game. Frankly, if you want the full experience of the Fractal, I kind of feel like you should play it. I don't like the idea that you're using my channel as just a raw substitute for the entire experience. I kind of get when I do raid coverage that you might want every little detail because you might genuinely think you're totally incapable of ever seeing it yourself, which is not true, by the way, but I know a lot of people will feel that way. But I mean, a Fractal that you can play at scale 25, and particularly for like the main Living World story and stuff as well, unless it's like a really standout, really strong line, I don't kind of want to piggyback on the entertainment value that ArenaNet themselves crafted by duplicating it in my video. It's tedious to set up, and yes, it makes the video itself a bit better, but I don't know whether I really want that to be my business, and it burned me out. It really did, hard. So I kept this one more about the poetry and the actual text information that now I can read out and give another sense to, which you would never get just from reading on your own. And I want to keep it more about the speculation and the discussion, and I wanted to see how the video would go. I'm kind of platforming this now, so it's probably going to look like I got a lot of feedback about it, but really, yours was basically the only comment, the only person who noticed my big insecurity for the video. So in general, I'm pretty reaffirmed that this is the way I want to do it. And I have mentioned this a long time ago now, but yeah, when you see I'm covering other Living World stuff, when all this voice acting comes into the most recent 2 patches, by the way, you can expect lore videos and stuff about it, but I'm not going to make it my business to copy-paste. Play the game, man. I mean, if you come out of the video feeling like there could be something extra, it's there. You just got to put on Guild Wars 2. So here we've got Shiny Fergus, who talks a little bit about the Graves again, but then down here talks about CMD. Aha, the other big mystery. What the hell was CMD? I honestly thought I was going to put that video up and everyone was going to say, WP, CMD appears on all Graves. It's X, Y, and Z. Especially with like this cultural divide and barrier for me where I'm just so unaccustomed and ignorant to stuff going on with like how Graves are structured on the East and stuff. I honestly thought someone would say, yeah, this appears a lot on Korean Graves or something, or Japanese Graves or Chinese Graves, and it means just this basic thing. But not only did no one have an appropriate answer, very few of you even seemed captivated by it. Now, to me, CMD is one of the more explicit mysteries that they've set up. And so, here's what Shiny says. I'm curious about CMD. As far as I know, it's not typically written on Graves. It hasn't been written on any Guild Wars Graves either previously. Now, I did check that as well. I did some wiki runs for both Guild Wars 1 and 2. Didn't find it there either. So, it is something like a Rest in Peace equivalent. It is likely specifically a Canthan thing. It's more likely to be initials, but there aren't any dates on this one either. Best guess is that it's I's mother, assuming I wrote the poem for mother. I think this is most likely 3 close deaths to drive her mad, but why no dates? And why not mention of her being a mother like the other 2 stating daughter or husband? It truly is just a random grave to add to the Canthan setting. That would be a bit disappointing. I wonder if it will ever be clarified. Me too, and your proposal there, it's a random grave to add to the Canthan setting. How does it add to the Canthan setting? Really? We just have no connection there. C for Cantha, and then month, date or something. I don't know. C for Canthan calendar. That was a placeholder. The studio never got it in. Let's maybe just assume that these graves in every way were work in progress, not quite finished, and then ended up in the release. No, this has to be a real mystery, surely. And that graveyard's filled with graves, but they assigned this one to have some extra detail on it. What the hell does CMD mean? I can't think of any major characters that CMD would work with. It's just there. How riveting. A fun interaction here. T.S. Bulmer says, I'm not on board with Hyoson being a Norn. Though I love the idea of Canthan Norn. If Norn humans were being purged, would one be suffered in the military? And Alonso says, maybe Norn were human-like enough for the Canthans to accept them. So, yeah, this has to be the story. If it really is a Norn, it has to be that they look close enough to humans that they slip through the xenophobia. And I mean, the story itself very directly goes into this idea that, whoa, look at how big and strong she is. You would never expect that. You know, they're kind of looking that idea directly in the eye. I'm very compelled by this concept of a story because it turns something I've always viewed to be a pretty lame element of the Norn into something fun. The Norn are one of the 5 playable races, and for all intents and purposes, 4 of those playable races are really unique and give you a very strong sense of a certain fantasy. You know, you want to play one of these really diminutive little races. The Asura are a treat. They are so much smaller than humans and smarter than humans, and everything about them feels really fun and different. You feel extremely distinct and different if you're playing a Sylvari, and likewise a Char. But then the Norn, they're just big people. Big humans? That's lame. That's not good enough, is it really? Or at least it doesn't rise to the bar that ArenaNet's so beautifully set for all the other races. So the Norn have kind of missed out, I think, in that way. I don't know, maybe there's actually a huge user base of nerds out there that really do just want to play big humans, but it feels like they haven't hit the bar, doesn't it? And it also feels like the games themselves have been a little skittish around that fact. But here, if with Cantha, they come out with this idea where it's like, yeah, they look like humans. We know that they look a lot like humans, and that's okay. Here's something compelling that came out of them looking a lot like humans. If they did that, that would just ooze confidence and really stop me looking at this as like a black sheep and make me think, no, this is actually a cool part of Tyria. They can do stuff with this. So I like this idea of the Norn being Cantha, and I especially like the idea that the Norn, above all others, managed to sneak through with that xenophobia. People don't talk, I think, enough about other races in Cantha. I don't think it's ArenaNet's ambition to be ultra human-centric in this X-Pack, not after the POF as well. I do think they want to keep it kind of cosmopolitan, if you will. They have good reason to talk about these other races. We know that the Asura had gates under there. It's very likely that they can manufacture a brilliant reason for the Sylvari to be connected to the Echovald Forest. And now here's something fun for the Norn too, especially as such a mountainous region, and so many of those mountains we couldn't actually explore in the original game. I saw a few of you guys left comments about the idea that the Norn have always been there. Maybe even during Guild Wars 1's time span, there were Norn there, we just didn't interact with them. Similar to how in Prophecies we didn't interact with them, even though they were there in the lore, you know, just up to the north in the far Shiver Peaks. I would 100% buy that, and I love the idea of Norn mixing with Canthans. Maybe they even influence each other in more ways than we expect. The only ones that really, I feel like, get the short end of the stick here are the Char, but surprise, surprise, we've just got Icebrood Saga, which is a real love letter to the Char. So maybe that's okay. Perhaps ArenaNet thought of all this long ago, and it's no coincidence that all this amazing Char stuff's happening right now, because they'll ease off a bit when we get to Cantha. And finally, to round out this part of the floor, just a minor correction from Ben Smith. The studio were called Triforge. I think I called them Triforce. But yeah, they were Triforge. That was their original name. And hey, the floor is a good opportunity for me to respond to little niggling mistakes that I might have made elsewhere, and we can actually talk about them in an open and non-explosive way. So there you have it, guys. That's a lot of what I thought coming out of the Sunqua Peak stuff. I'm going to leave this topic to rest now, but I would love to hear anything further you were prompted to say down below. And now I'm in a weird place. I imagined the floor as like almost like a podcast where each part has its own designated topic, but I feel like I'm also just getting a mishmash of random things people want to talk about. So if you want this to be really topic oriented, this is your chance to, down below, really propose one, give some supplementary information, and we'll go from there. Otherwise, this might just become a little bit more like classic Q&A, and we'll go all over the place. I really don't know what I'm doing with it at the moment. But yeah, I guess that'll be answered on the next part of the floor. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.